Chapter 5. Rain on the 4th of July may have been reluctantly acceptable, but rain on a favorite cousin's wedding day was perfectly offensive. That the two occasions should coincidentally bear such disappointment made Annalee huff as she wiped away the spittle that had come from her mouth during the night and stepped to the window to open the curtains in her bedroom. It was 7 in the morning, and it was dark enough to be 5. She had thought when the rain started the evening before that by now it would have passed over. She turned up the flame in her lamp. Poor Coretta. Annalee could imagine what she was feeling. It was just the sort of thing that would probably happen on her own wedding day. She turned to Coretta's brown traveling dress in the corner and smoothed out the skirt. For the first time in her life, her cousin wouldn't be at Oakshade to celebrate the country's independence. She and Daniel were leaving for the train to Cleveland directly after the reception. He had relations there who, though unable to attend the wedding, wanted very much to meet his bride. Their honeymoon would last only a few days. The new Conscription Act would go into effect soon, and, like every other farmer around Newkirk, Daniel was convinced he would be drafted. Papa had tried to persuade Daniel that the money he offered was simply a wedding present, that $300 would pay for his exemption from the draft was entirely coincidental. But Daniel had succeeded where most men failed in refusing the generosity. How could he do otherwise, Sam had said when she tried to get him to talk his brother into accepting a way out of the fighting. Coretta had simply hoped his name wouldn't come up in the drawing after all. "Well," Annalee muttered. That was enough meditation for one day. She brought out her own dress and spread it across the bed to admire with a proud smile the work she had done. But the smile faded into a grimace when she thought of the corset that must go on under it. She started piling everything she had to wear onto the bed beside her now less attractive dress. Corset cover, pantalettes, petticoat, her whitest crinoline. Infernal nuisances, those crinolines. She had always wondered how everyone in town could fit into church with so many skirts taking up twice as much space as they ought. What was it her favorite play character had said? "Oh, that I were a man!" Annalee put the back of her hand to her forehead and fell back into the bed with a hysterical air that she'd once seen an actress affect. That woman had played Beatrice with considerably less gumption than Annalee had imagined in her reading, and she laughed at herself for imitating the misrepresentation. Once the dress was on, after a minor row with Mrs. Dow about how loose she was determined to wear the corset, Annalee had to admit as she stood on her bed to get a better view of herself in the half-mirror above her dresser that, despite the nuisance under the lavender cloth, she made a pretty picture. Of course, she still had to put up her hair, but that could wait until after she had helped Rebecca. She tucked some of the shorter hair that had come out of its braid during the night behind her ears, and flipped the ever-loosening braid behind her back as she stepped down from the bed to head for her sister's room. She passed Teague's room and glanced in as she always did. He was asleep at his desk, the candle wick beside him smoked in its tiny stump of wax, and the bedclothes lay untouched. She had told him when she had discovered his habit of writing himself to sleep that he would murder his back by staying at his desk, but he had just shrugged off the admonition. "Teague?" she called from the door. He didn't move, so she went to his desk. His mouth was mashed up against the arm his head lay on, and the spectacles he hadn't bothered to take off were pressed up to sit crookedly on his nose. Annalee smiled and shook his arm as she glanced to the open journal that he had pushed away during the night. The small, slanted script was barely legible, but she could make out a few of the words on this page. "Like Athena in her temple. It is strange, though, to find wisdom in a world that so apathetically tolerates warfare, for to my mind the presence of one presupposes the absence of the other." She turned her attention back to him and shook his arm harder. "Teague?" He still didn't respond. She knelt beside him. "Teague!" She reached for his chin and lifted his head. "Teague!" He didn't wake up. She rose to run to the door, but stopped when she heard a disgusted groan. "Teague!" she bent again. "What?" he answered in an annoyed, half-asleep tone. Annalee stepped back at his anger. "Are you all right?" I'm fine. His voice was only slightly gentler. Well, you'd better get ready for the wedding, then. He squinted up at her. Who? He stared for a moment before breathing in as if from a sudden recollection. Oh. He sat up straight and removed his spectacles before alternately squeezing his eyes shut and opening them, as though the exercise might better wake him. When he began to stand, he faltered and fell to his right, and Annalie's support was all that kept him from going completely down. She set him back in his chair, where he stared at his stump and laughed that awful, humorless laugh that never failed to make Annalie want to cry with him and scream at him, both at the same time. I can feel my foot on the floor, he said in explanation. I always can. I just forgot. Annalie breathed down her impulse for outburst. Are you certain you're all right? Should I get Papa or— No, he interrupted. No, I'm fine. You can go on and get ready. I'm all right. Friday, 28 December 1860. It pains me to write this, but I fear I will be a long time coming back to Sweet Afton. Since his family is in Europe, Aubrey came with me from school to celebrate the season. But Christmas was less than holy, as the Saviour was utterly outdone by talk of secession. Oh, come all ye faithful, to the cause of Southern independence. Needless to say, Father Will and I didn't have the best time of it, and parted on bitter terms. How can I make them see that Alabama, the entire South for that matter, cannot survive without the Union? They refuse to hear reason, having been inspired to deafness by the rhetoric of the honor-bound fools who think they can run a plantation and fight a war at the same time. Protest the weakness of Northerners as they will, the South will never be allowed to break away peacefully. It is a misbegotten and lost cause from the beginning. I remember Father saying about waste, and cannot fathom why he does not realize what a waste of men and time a war will entail. For Will's part, he believes everything Father says is God's own holy gospel, and he did not hesitate to support Father when his voice became worn out from yelling. They even berated Aubrey for taking my view, guest though he was. Caroline asked why we were all being so bull-headed, and I told her to ask Father, as he has so much experience with the trait. She told me to apologize for yelling, and maybe he won't be so angry. The poor child simply does not understand. She said she would write me every week to let me know when Father's temper has quieted. I'm so sorry she and Mother had to cry through Christmas because of our quarrel, but I cannot hold with this asinine notion. If Anderson Scott and Alabama go, I shall not go with them. The rain has stopped at least. Annalie looked out the window as she set the cake on the dining-room table. It was the last preparation she could make. Garlands of wild flowers and orange blossoms were draped all through the room and around the front door of the house. Annalie tied on her bonnet as she stepped to the front door beside her mother and glanced up at the steady tap-thump that could come only when Teague was descending. "Captain," Mama said, "you look smart." Actually, he was dressed in the only suit he owned, and Mama had seen it repeatedly over the past weeks. He'd lain in the grass in it for half the afternoon only yesterday. But Mama was right. It was immaculately cleaned and brushed, and he was wearing a new shirt, collar, and cravat. He'd spent the last few cents of his paycheck for those, Annalie knew. "Very fine," she concurred with her mother. Teague seemed to blush, but something in his coloring didn't seem to fit with simple embarrassment at a compliment. Perhaps Annalie was merely overreacting to his behavior of earlier in the morning, but despite the courteous response he made, she was convinced that he was not well. "How could I not appear so when in the company of so many fine ladies?" "Horses are hitched," Papa said as he and John stomped the mud from their feet at the front door, and as Teague reached the bottom of the stairs. Rebecca came from her room wearing the light green muslin print John had brought back from Philadelphia in the spring. She was thinner than he had remembered, and she had worked harder than she should have to take it in to fit. With Rebecca, one needed no convincing that she was not well. Be careful as you go out to the carriage. It's gotten pretty soggy out there, Papa said, and offered his arm to Mama when they walked out onto the porch. Watch your skirts, girls, Mama called back to her daughters, holding up her own out of the mud. Annalie stood by the stairs waiting for Lucy while John and Rebecca went outside and Teague started after them. Come on now, Sprite. As soon as Annalie spoke, Lucy ran to the steps and hopped down as quickly as she could. Annalie caught her at the bottom, picked her up, and held her face close. Don't run, though. You'll fall and ruin your dress. Lucy wriggled in her arms. I want down. Do you promise to mind? I promise. I really mean it. Annalie set her on the ground. Lucy took a few steps and then bolted in an obvious attempt to draw her aunt into a game of chase. She ran onto the porch and to the steps Teague had just finished descending, but then lost her footing and tumbled forward. Teague dropped his crutches to reach out to catch her and went down to his knee in the mud as she fell into his arms. She stayed there dazed for a moment before pushing away from him. No, no, no! She cried. He let her go and watched her run away to her father. Let me help you. Annalie and Papa reached down and spoke together. He waved them away. I'll just get you filthy. They stepped back as he indicated, and he braced himself on his crutches. The bottom of one slipped out from under him in the mud, and Teague didn't even have time to catch himself with his hands before his chest hit the muddy surface as well. He raised himself up on his palms, looked down at himself, and laughed. I'm floundering like a flounder. He laughed even louder. Annalie looked to Papa while he watched the man on the ground. His eyes held that contemplative quality she'd seen when he was examining a bedridden patient whose illness he'd not quite figured out. He turned to John. Take them all ahead in the carriage. We'll follow in the buggy. John glanced down at Teague and nodded. Right. Go with them, Annalie, Papa said as he bent to help Teague up. I'll stay with you. She started to reach for Teague, but Papa shook his head. There's room for only 2 in the buggy. She started to speak, but then walked toward the carriage. She looked back to the porch as they pulled away. Papa and Teague were going up the steps, one standing erect and the other hunched over on his crutches. His back was moving, but as the distance between them was increasing, she couldn't tell if he was laughing or crying. She could tell that her own throat was constricting, and she was only now aware from the tightening of her chest inside the corset how hard she was breathing.